to thank Cello Bello for inviting me to participate in this cello chat. I know how important these chats have been for all of us during this, especially during this really tough time we're in right now. So in thinking about what I wanted to discuss, what would be the most appropriate topic to discuss with all of you today, I came to the conclusion that I was most interested in using today's chat to explore the challenges that so many of us have faced during the transition to teaching and learning online. Although some of my colleagues have been using this tool very successfully for years to supplement face-to-face teaching and have become quite comfortable and adept with this form of teaching, I'm very jealous. For someone who has what I would call borderline technophobia, and I have no trouble admitting that, this abrupt change that we all saw in March was shocking and unsettling. And you're looking at a person whose son very kindly provided her with a flow chart in order to help her remember how to attach a document to an email. In my defense, this was many years ago, and I'm much more competent now. But in the early days of the transition to online teaching during the pandemic, many of us were in touch with each other, just to check in, of course, and see how we were doing, but also to share teaching survival strategies. I think it's safe to say that it was a confusing and difficult time, and we have all gone through different phases in acknowledging the pros and cons of online teaching. And I find them to be similar, but not necessarily including all of the traditional 5 stages of grief and loss. So certainly, I think we all found that one of the first things that we felt was we were in denial. And we all said very naively and optimistically, well, we'll be back together in time for the end of the semester, and schools were planning recitals and juries, and that very quickly changed. So, moving on from our denial phase, a lot of us then felt frustrated and angry. And the feeling was like, how are we supposed to teach and learn effectively when we're dealing with the fact that Zoom is really glitchy at times, or whatever platform we've chosen to use. Internet connections can be very unreliable, especially overseas and in some parts of this country as well. And the sound quality can be terrible. Sometimes it's okay. People have found different fixes for that, but at worst it's terrible. So then we moved on to often feelings of depression and sadness. I see that we have a question already, but I just want to finish this part of the presentation, and I would be delighted to address your question. So, the feeling of like, I truly miss seeing my students live. I miss the energy of the weekly in-person performance classes. I feel frustrated on like, how do I create community with my students when we're all in little boxes on a screen? But even more importantly, how can I help my students who are having a really hard time? How can I help my family and friends and myself when everything is a question mark and it's really hard to find optimism, in the words of one of my students? And so there is another phase that we find ourselves, we hope, in, which is acceptance, which is, for better or for worse, this is where we are. So let's get on with our work and find the best ways to find inspiration from each other and help our students maintain as much forward momentum as possible. You know, the reality is it would not be exaggerating to say that we're trying to find our way through fallout and ongoing challenges of our really collective worldwide trauma. And even as we have to acknowledge that many of us are in places of relative privilege and safety. Even doing that, it's really unbelievably difficult for many of us to focus and learn under these circumstances. And acknowledging that this is the reality of our situation is in many ways an important step in moving forward. One of the jokes that I had with my family and my friends and my students from the beginning was how important it was to ignore the idea of the best COVID self. So, you know, if you want permission to acknowledge that it's not necessary to stick with your plans to do a 30-day plank challenge, which some of my students were doing with each other, or post a popper on a day online just because you can. The more important thing for me is continuing to work and learn as non-competitively as possible in whatever form is possible. And that is the achievement in and of itself. Sometimes this isn't possible, and we all need to learn to forgive ourselves for being emotionally vulnerable, or just tired of being brave, or needing a break from being productive or inspired. And sometimes, you know, inspiration for these things can come from a really wide variety of sources. I read one yesterday in an email from a man named Steve Sando, who is the founder and owner of Rancho Gordo Beans, an heirloom dried bean company, which certainly has seen a brisk business in this pandemic. So first he shared a delicious recipe, and then he shared something even more valuable, which is he compared the response to this pandemic to a relay race. And he said, and I quote, "We can carry the baton for each other while we lose it, gather strength, then carry on. The world seems out of control, but we can control our kitchens and the good things that come out of them." So if we substitute practicing listening and learning together for kitchens and cooking, then I think we have a very good way to address the inevitable ups and downs that we all face together. So I wanted to, again, before I address the question, just wanted to share some things that I've learned and find that there are advantages to learning online. One is attentiveness to screens can work to our advantage. I mean, we've actually been practicing this in various ways for quite some time, some of us more than others. So some students focus really well on screen, others need to be encouraged to look at themselves directly in order to look at a specific technical and physical point. Some of the ones that I found have worked particularly well are really looking to make sure that you're playing with a straight and consistent bow line. Looking at your body alignment, arm height, shoulder use, or the other favorite, tight thumbs, which can be seen really well if you're looking. And so there's so many ways we can use gallery view to compare and contrast what the teacher and student are doing. We can use different camera angles to show different things. We can make video recordings of each lesson so that students can have a document, a video document, and a way to review all of our topics covered and actually retain even more information. So we've also found that the sharing of pre-recorded lesson videos has been invaluable, and it inspires much greater accountability from both student and teacher. Students have no choice but to present movements, pieces, excerpts, etudes, portions of those, but no stopping in a video for that time-honored technique. But I had a question, which none of us ever did at any point in our studies, I know. But it also encourages students to self-evaluate, to send not their first version, but their best version. And often these videos give us a much better sense of what's going on with sound than Zoom does. I actually prepare differently now for the lessons because I have the video. I look at it multiple times. I take very specific notes, and I make a very specific lesson plan for what I want to address during the time we have together. And this has worked really well for so many students who've prepared for online auditions, performances, and master classes, where we're in touch every few days, and we have so much more access to each other than the usual 1 hour per week. So I have more to say, but I want to address Peter's question, which was, teaching is an integral part of a musician's career. How did you begin and develop your pedagogical skills, and how have they evolved over time? So Peter, that is, of course, one of my favorite topics is teaching. I was very, very lucky in that I was given the opportunity to serve as an assistant teacher to a number of people when I was in my middle 20s, just out of school. And I often say that I do feel sorry for some of those students, because I think when you start teaching at any point when you're that young, that it's definitely a work in progress and an ongoing experiment. So that is how I really started to learn. That's how I started to learn. And I feel really fortunate that I had the time and the chance to learn by doing. So I had no strict pedagogical, technique training. But I was also very lucky in that I had very, very good teachers from early on. And I think about them all the time as I'm teaching now. How have they evolved? How have my skills evolved over time? Well, I'm always looking for new information for myself, like what is the best way to address a specific technical challenge, or how can I deepen my understanding of any piece of music that I'm working on. And I try to communicate that way of working to my students, so that we have an organized way of problem solving. We have a body of knowledge. We have information now. How do we experiment and find the best way to do things? One thing I've learned over the years is that the physical differences between students need to inform how you work with them in terms of technique. So what might work for one student, I've had, my tallest student was, I think he's 6'9" or 10 now. And that was a whole different challenge from working with someone very small. Working with someone who's built very broadly is very different from working with someone who is built in a much more narrow way. And so we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to technique. We have to understand that there are certain laws of physics and motion that work no matter what, but how they're applied is going to be very different from student to student. And this is true also just in terms of emotional development of students. I try to see them all as really unique, physically, emotionally, musically. And one thing I'm very proud of is the fact that my students all sound very different from each other. And I think that is a result of the kind of work we do together. So I hope that answers that question. Here's another question from Christopher. How do you help students working on a contemporary, obscure piece of music? Where do you start? How do you approach it, especially if you can't find any background information or recordings? That is such a good question. So, you know, to throw it right back to music apart from contemporary or obscure, I think any piece of music that you're working on has to be approached from the point of view of how is it made, what are the building blocks, what is the composer expressing, is there any historical context for it, are there any pieces similar to that? The thing that I try to do is I try to help a student find a way to, through the looking at the score, to find a way to understand the inspiration of the composer. And, you know, the thing to remember is that you know, we get a little bit phobic sometimes of music that we don't know or that has an unfamiliar language. And I think it's very important to try to get inside the composer's head or emotions and find a way in that way. Find what we think may have inspired the composer. I mean, certainly finding a unique sound world is something that we see often in contemporary music. Finding structure, finding syntax, finding phrasing, just as we would with Brahms, is I think absolutely necessary. And I think sometimes, you know, we have access so often to background information and recordings on the internet that we will start there when we're looking at any piece of music, which is great because we have that. But on the other hand, then the burden is on us to find that way in. And especially if there are extended techniques in a piece of music. If that's something you're not familiar with, often you can contact the composer directly and ask, well, what did you mean? How do you want this to sound? What is it that you're interested in? It's interesting, a student was just working on Sarajevo's Sept Papillon, and first of all, this is, you know, other than what you were saying, if you can't find background information or recordings, but what was amazing was to watch Ansi Kartunen explaining the technique of the piece online and to see how that was part and parcel with the inspiration for the composer. So if you don't have someone to do that for you, that's something you have to try to do yourself. So I hope that helps. Next question. As a student, how does one make online lessons more beneficial for oneself? Is there anything to do to prepare differently as the student for the lesson to be more beneficial? Well, that is the whole point. That's the whole point. So, again, what I have found is that, of course, it's a two-way street, and in normal times, preparation for the student is essential, and preparation for the teacher is essential. Having said that, the care that you put into making a recording in advance is an investment in the quality of your experience in your lesson. So, because things can happen, Zoom can glitch, the internet can get weird, but if you have given the teacher, a really good, clear video to work with, you can get an amazing amount done. An amazing amount done. And I have really learned this from the months that I've spent working with my students online. The other thing is, and this touches on something else that I wanted to discuss, is that, you know, it's really, I've seen a lot of people who have been wanting to focus mainly on technique during this time. And I understand the impulse to do that, and I think it's a great opportunity to do that. A pauper a day online notwithstanding. But I think the more that you, as a student, can be studying the piece as a whole, learning the piano score, learning about historical context, making it a richer experience for yourself and informing your musical decisions in that way, then you will get much more out of it. And I really have found, like, I think it's important to find inspiration from each other as teacher-student in any context. But I think we all do our best work when we are as prepared as possible in the ways that I've just discussed. And I hope that's helpful. Here is a question from Oscar. How do you encourage students to feel and work the feeling of weight in the bow hand? Oh, Oscar, that's my most favorite thing ever. Thank you. So I think one of the really big things that I feel very strongly about is the fact that we spend a lot of time thinking about the hands, playing with the hands. And it's not that we shouldn't do that, but in reality, the weight that you're going to feel, the support that you're going to feel, is going to come from so much further back than the hand. And the idea is really to keep the hand flexible, aligned, able to move, part and parcel with the arm, so that we don't have any of this stuff going on, my least favorite thing, and that we can feel the weight, the transfer of weight, the energy coming straight down from the shoulder into the instrument. Literally straight down. And what supports the shoulder is, of course, and my students are tired of hearing me say this, but you can hear it again, is support from here, from the abdomen, from the abs, from the core, from the feet on the floor, from the sitting bones being right there in the chair. You are lifted up so that your weight can come right down. It's really simple. It's just physics. And the simpler the approach for me, the more I am able to feel like I have a direct access of weight from my body, through my shoulder, through my arm, right into the string. So this is the feeling of weight. The bow hand is actually quite light and flexible, but the weight is coming from above. I also find it's really important to maintain stability in the use of the right arm. For instance, again, lifting doesn't work so well for me, and drooping doesn't work well for me. It does for other people, but as I said earlier on, all different shapes and sizes of students. This, however, for me is a universal no matter how tall or small or wide or narrow you are. So that you'll find that if you have your weight coming this way and you are able to adjust your angle of use of the hand, that you will have the same access to the weight at the tip as you would here at the frog. And that anything in between is a matter of adjustment. You notice that my arm is not changing really. It's not lifting, it's not doing any of this. It's right there. So that is how I feel weight. I wouldn't say in the bow hand, I would say through the bow hand. So I could of course talk about that for about 24 hours straight, but we don't have time for that now. And from Daniel, what is your approach as a teacher when it comes to a student's interpretation of the music? What are some things you do to help them bring it out? And where do you draw the line between interpretation and going against the composer's intentions? Daniel, that's a great question. So, I like to listen to and look at music of a composer that is not necessarily specifically the piece that you're looking at that moment. I think that we can find inspiration in finding our own interpretation by learning the language of any composer, or of learning more about the time in which the composer was writing, or other composers, or people before, or so inspirations for the composer. So if a student is working on a Beethoven sonata, say C major, 102, number 1, and those of my students who've worked on C major are like, yeah, she's saying that thing about the piano sonatas again. The first thing you do is you look at adjacent works. So there are amazing piano sonatas all around that. So there's Opus 101, amazing in the language of the composer. The more you know about the composer's intentions and inspiration, the more you feel empowered to making a good decision. Where I object to things is when I feel like a student, or anyone for that matter, is making a decision about interpretation that's being made in a vacuum. So again, this is a question of the more you know, the more rich your understanding is of a composer, and the more you feel like you have the right to make a decision. So I hope that helps, Daniel. I hope that's an answer. We can discuss more of that later. from Thomas, Julia. How are you keeping your work alive and inspired during this unique time, musical and non-musical? Well, you know, the true answer is that, like anyone, I have good days and bad days, and within those days I have good hours and bad hours. And I think it's really necessary to find what works for you. What works for me right now, and I am absolutely telling the truth when I say this, is my students are so incredibly helpful to me right now because I feel engaged with music through them, and I feel that I'm being of service to them, and that means everything to me. So that is an enormous thing. Also, I have given myself permission to really go down what we call rabbit holes in terms of if I'm interested in a composer or a piece, to explore it very, very deeply, and to look at all kinds of historical sources, which it's all available online, or performances that I find inspiring. Even if I'm not performing, it really doesn't matter, because these are this work that we're doing now is going to serve us very well when things are more normal. And honestly, and she'll probably get annoyed with me for saying this, but watching my daughter work during this time has been amazingly inspiring. She is a circus artist. She's an aerialist. She has not been near the apparatus that she needs to train since March, and yet she is moving forward. She is working with discipline. She's thinking about the things that she wants to create in the future. And that is an amazing thing to watch. And I'm also very, very lucky because my husband is David Gaber, is also a cellist and is in this with me. And we talk all the time about how we can best help our students and how we can get through this so that we come out the other side and feel like we have all made progress. So, next question. This is from Yidwo, who I know. How do you encourage students to relax the muscle of the right arm when playing fast pieces of music? For example, the second movement of Elgar Concerto. So that is a great question too. If you're still watching, maybe you can maybe you can tell me exactly where you're feeling tension. So when you say the muscle of the right arm, do you mean all muscles? Do you mean like forearm? Do you mean here? Well, let me try to see if I can answer your question, and then please write in if I haven't. So, like so many things, if you are playing, if you want to be able to play fast, if you are tight anywhere, that is going to serve as a drag on your ability to move. So I know you weren't asking about the left hand, but that, for instance, if you're trying to move quickly, the more pressure you put down, the more difficult it is to move. So when you are playing, for instance, Elgar, number one, you need to find the absolute ideal height for the arm, the shoulder. Again, none of this, none of that, so that you are actually supporting the weight of your arm from further back in your body, here, 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 the back body, which I mean all of this, is very, very important for this, because when that is all in place, then you can not feel like you have to work here, if that makes sense. That kind of thing. So the other thing is to find the absolute perfect balance point in the bow where the action reaction here will happen automatically. So if you're too low in the bow, then you're going to have to be working for every stroke. If you're too far out in the bow, then you're going to feel like you don't have the control to keep the bow more on the string. So again, when you find that very balanced place, right? So that really helps immediately. Again, tension in the muscles often comes from using the wrong part of the body to play, or playing too big. So I hope that helps in some way. Please write in again if you need more specific information. Oh, ROSY. Could you share any ideas or methods of practice for developing consistency on the cello? Oh, yeah. So that's a great question, Rosie. And again, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that fully in the time that we have, but here are some ideas, just thinking about that. So there are different ways in which we train ourselves. One is a certain kind of repetition of the most effective, correct way of doing something, so that you can learn to trust your body. If you find that you're issuing directives to yourself in a kind of granular way, that means that you are, number one, not using the part of your brain which allows you to be in flow, but also that your body actually doesn't know how to do what you need to do. So, repetition in a mindful way, finding the most effective way to give yourself access to what you have learned and what you're trying to teach your body. And then there are always going to be times when you have identified the need for what we call process cues. So in other words, if you have trained a shift properly, but you find that you don't have 100% access to that, sometimes we look for a one-word cue that will flip us into the right place. You know, often, or feeling how to set the body up properly so that you can move easily. For me, that's the really first step towards consistency, is the way you train. And sometimes people forget exactly how much repetition of the right thing is necessary in order to help the body know that it's it's got this. It can do it automatically. So, Rosie, I hope that's helpful in some way. The thing to remember too is that not only does the body need to be trained, but it's also really helpful to see and hear in advance what it is that you want to do. So, we talk about being in the moment, but in fact, we need to be in multiple moments. We need to be present during what we're doing, but we need also to be able to see ahead and to envision and hear what we want to do. That works for me. And now a question from Kyle. To maintain your sound throughout the entirety of a phrase, how do you think about bow weight and bow momentum, specifically during bow changes? That is also a great question. Kyle, do you have 48 hours? We'll discuss it for all of those hours. But I think the most important thing to remember is what I was saying before, is the use of proper use so that you are able to easily access your weight throughout the bow. Having said that, and my students have heard me say this endlessly, the thing that we need to remember is that bow use is extremely asymmetrical, and that if we try to make it matchy-matchy or symmetrical, it actually causes more problems than we might think. So, for instance, if you are at the frog, obviously this is a really comfy place with a lot of natural weight. You don't need so much speed in a bow change at the frog. You need to maintain your motion, and you need to make sure that while you are maintaining your contact from here, that you are able to release the hand. So when you're... You see what I mean? So if I were to speed up, then I probably would get an involuntary crescendo that I don't love so much. If I were to not be aware of what's going on here, then we might also get the involuntary weighty crescendo. So we need to adjust what we're doing, and that's where the hand comes into it. But when we're at the tip, so there we're going to increase our speed. Again, maintaining the simplicity of the contact, but increasing our speed so that we can get ourselves around the corner and maintain the sound and motion. Hope that helps. Another question from Daniel. Could you walk through your process of organizing a big shift, such as the many shifts at the ending of the fourth movement of the Elgar Concerto just before the restatement of the first movement theme? That's really great, Daniel. So we were talking about training the body, training the ear. So for instance, when you're... Okay. Not in tune, sorry about that. So if I want to learn better the distance, remember that the slowest part of your shift in general is going to be right before you land. So under a slur, and stop when you're there. So that so often we'll miss something because we'll go too fast. And you lose your ability, first of all, to control the landing and to hear what you're doing. Okay, so step number 1 is really teaching your body what the distance is, teaching your ear. Yeah? And I will often do that slowly, not too loudly, under a slur so that I can really keep track. And back. Yeah, and so that really helps immediately with the training process. Yeah? Then the next move I might make would be still not, in performance mode, seeing what that's like, not under a slur. And also figuring out, what is the best arm height that enables me to do this. What I've discovered is that the more things you do, if you're down and then you lift, that's a lot. That's a lot to do, and we want to keep it simple and direct. So examine that. Like, I will tell my students, start from this height and then figure out where you can be so that you are minimizing the changes. See that? Sometimes that's not kind of a naturally intuitive thing for people to do. But the whole point is, with a big shift, you want to eliminate all of the things that make it complicated and that cause friction. So that's an answer. And here is another question. So many of us are turning to unaccompanied works these days. Could you talk about your approach to bowings in the cello suites of J.S. Bach? Oh, Chelsea, thanks. The bowings in the Anna Magdalena manuscript are interesting, albeit inconsistent, and were designed for a different type of bow than what we use now. Do you consult Mrs. Bach, that's Ms. Bach to you, Chelsea, or do you choose bowings to suit your own interpretation? That's a really good question, Chelsea, and there are many, many, many people who have a much more scholarly approach than I do. But I do definitely look at those bowings, and I try to understand again what is being expressed in those bowings. Also, I look at other works of Bach that I've played. I mean, this is the I think the message I'm trying to give somewhat is that, we can't do any of this in a vacuum, and the more we know, the more we know. So that if I see that a kind of bowing pattern in a certain type of figuration shows up again and again, then I'm going to think about that. So I know you say they were designed for a different type of bow than what we use now, but honestly, I think that the most helpful thing that I have done with this is, if I don't know what is the right way to use the bow, I will actually hold the bow here as if it were a Baroque bow and see how I use the bow. See where I end up. See how that affects the stroke and what I do with it. Yeah, so that that to me, I would never perform it like this, but that will affect my decision about. Do you see what I mean? So that has been a really important tool for me in making decisions. In my student days in Boston, I used to pretend that I was a Baroque cellist, and I would borrow a friend's transition bow and put 2 gut strings here and take my end pin out, and actually did a whole bunch of performing that way. My students have heard me say this a lot, so sorry. But those were days in which Honor Bilsma spent a lot of time in Boston. It was fantastic. It was amazing to be around him and to watch him and to learn from him. And you know, he didn't start as a Baroque cellist. He started as just a regular classical cellist. But of course, watching how he used the bow and the decisions that he made, it was very, very influential. And so I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to take a look at what naturally happens, because that's how they were playing when these were written. So that, yeah, so that when you actually do it, then it becomes more natural. The worst thing you can do is to try to shoehorn playing in the wrong part of the bow, other than what you would naturally do here, and try to make it work. It actually works much better when you do what it does naturally. Okay, question from Carlos. Hope that helped, Chelsea. How do you approach teaching vibrato to a student who has just started to learn it? Okay, Carlos, truth be told, I don't do much teaching at all of younger students. I feel enormous respect for those who do, but I don't work on that level very much at all. But if I were to be thinking about that, here are some things that I find important, and I know that that there are people who really do work all the time with young children who would have a much more organized approach to it. But again, I think the important thing to remember about vibrato is that it's motion, and that anything that we're doing with our bodies that inhibits motion needs to be looked at. So if you're pressing too hard, it's going to make it really hard to move. If you're squeezing with your thumb, it's really, you can't move, right? The idea of, or if you have a tight high shoulder, you can't move. The idea is to use the best use of the body. Set it up, wide, open shoulder, arm aligned, deliver the hand lightly to the string. And you find that the actual motion of putting it down, if you're not squeezing too hard, you can put it down and it moves. And that's the beginning for me of vibrato. Also, you have to really think about like contact point. If that's too spiky, collapsed fingers also cause a problem. So again, the good alignment of the hand is very, very, very important. The other thing to remember is that vibrato doesn't happen in a vacuum, that the best thing you can do is make your best sound here, and that this will enhance it. So, sorry that I can't be more specific for a beginner. Another question. What are some ways you warm up in the morning that helps your body wake up and prepare for practice? Okay, so here is the absolute truth. I don't have a set warm-up routine. I really admire people who do. I'm not being my best COVID self. But what I do, and that's really what's very, very important to me, because I'm so interested in best use of the body and overall health and alignment, is, and my students know this, I will absolutely work thinking, putting into practice posture, alignment. I also do things to get my heart rate up before I touch the cello. So again, there's so many ways you can do that. I find that my best way is above the shoulder, is arm circles this way, supporting from here up, 10 one way, 10 the other way, so that you're really getting everything moving here and getting your blood flowing. So the whole point is, I don't have specific things that I do with my hands to warm up. I will do dynamic bowing exercises, I will do scales, I will do arpeggios, but what I'm doing as I'm doing those things is I'm reminding myself of the best possible use for the body and keeping in motion, keeping balanced, keeping light. So that's the truth, Alex. And here's some Dariusz. Oh my goodness. He says, I saw you play a recital in Poland in the mid-'80s. Very inspiring. You played Beethoven 3 beautifully. I think it was Beethoven 1, Dariusz, but I'm not sure. Could you tell us more about that performance? Well, number one, I can thank you so much for writing and for your really, really kind words. That was a really amazing performance. I mean, just the opportunities to perform in Poland. I loved meeting Polish musicians and people. Fantastic experience. Really, the experiences were unforgettable. What I can't remember is that performance, because I can barely remember what I did yesterday. But what I do know is that my pianist and I worked very, very carefully on that sonata, that it was a genuine collaboration. And again, as I was saying earlier, the idea of putting all of these pieces into a perspective so that you feel like, yes, I know, because I think it was the F major that we did, that I know what this means. I understand the man who wrote this early Beethoven. So, but thank you so much for writing. It brings back a lot of great memories. Mika, what are some tips that you would give your students about staying motivated and disciplined while practicing at home during quarantine? That is so hard. That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you all about this. So one of the things I would say is pay attention to how you feel. Like, if you are truly in a not good place, often two things can happen. One, you try to force it and you practice and you feel not so good. Two, you decide to do it anyway and you find your way through it and you feel much better as a result. So one of the things that I have done in my life is when I'm feeling really not inspired to practice, I'll get myself in physical motion. I won't play the cello. I'll actually go for a walk, or I will exercise, and I'll get myself physically in motion, because sometimes you just feel stuck. And I think a lot of us are feeling really stuck right now because we're literally stuck at home. But just to change things, change the channel, move. Don't sit there and feel bad and feel like even more isolated with it. Or be in touch with a friend and say, are you practicing? What are you doing? You know, or how are you? Just anything to connect, Also, I find that if I do things at the same time during the day, that is really helpful. Because you know that moment when you're thinking, well, should I exercise or not? I don't know. This coffee is delicious. That you, if you know, and for me it's like, okay, it's 5:30, I am going to exercise now. The less volition you have in it, sometimes it kind of carries you along. So that habit can be really helpful and powerful. The other thing is, and my students know this because I've said this to all of you, keep things fresh with your repertoire. Definitely keep it fresh. One of the great things is that we have the time to go very, very deep into study of repertoire. But at the beginning of all of this, I said to my students, and you were one of them, Mischa, let's find something new to work on, because I don't want you to feel like you're quarantined with J.C. Bach. Right? So that's, in other words, it was a piece you'd been working on for a long time and you're like, oh God, I have to do this again. So I think finding a balance between new and old that you're trying to do in depth is really important. I think it's important for teachers to have that kind of awareness, that you that's what our students may need right now. So I think that's important. I mean, the other thing that is helpful is sometimes to have a project or a date in front of you, like on this date I am going to share this with my friends, I'm going to play for them, I'm going to give a performance, I have something that I need to do, because we all work better when we have those kinds of goals and deadlines in front of us. So I hope that's helpful. It's a challenge that we're all facing. I think, again, remember the best COVID self. It's just like you do what's humanly possible. Do I have any favorite pieces? Do you have any favorite pieces, this is from Daniel, you feel are not well enough known, or favorite pieces for teaching that are off the beaten path? Well, Daniel, that's a great question. I'm pretty much a traditionalist as far as the basic pieces that we have go. I have been absolutely loving exploring Walton Concerto with a few of my students. I think it's a magnificent piece, and I think many people don't play it so much. And surprisingly, I don't know, maybe this is a British thing I'm thinking of. So surprisingly, the music of Britain and of Frank Bridge, who was his teacher. The Frank Bridge Sonata is a magnificent piece. And then there's all of the contemporary music out there. So I think it looks like we may be in need of stopping. I'm sorry, Daniel, that was a quick response. So I'm being asked if I have any closing remarks. I think really from my heart to anyone who's watching, these are really, really tough times, and the the more we can connect with each other and to be honest about the challenges that we're facing and the things that we've found have made life easier for us, I think we'll all be much better off as a result. And acknowledging that it's hard to stay positive, that it's hard to find our way through this, but we've had to redefine what it means to be patient. And that is a skill that is going to work well for us no matter what when all of this is over. Patience, discipline, and really acceptance of how much we all need each other and how amazing it is that we can connect with each other. And so that's really my message to everyone. So I wish all of you absolutely the best of luck. Keep working, keep positive, and please feel free to be in touch with any more questions. We're all here for each other. So those are my closing remarks.